Idols are not gods. There is one God, and through Christ salvation is granted to believers. Those whom the mob worship are not gods. All this is evident from the following. There were once kings whom those who were close to them in royal memory began to honor even after death. They founded temples for them, and in order to preserve the faces of the dead in the image, they carved statues, slaughtered victims, and solemnly celebrated the days dedicated to them. Subsequently, what was done by those closest to them for their own consolation became sacred for posterity. Let us see in particular whether this was everywhere the case. Melicertes and Locothea are cast into the sea and then become sea gods. The casters die alternately in order to live. Aesculapius is burned by lightning in order to become a god. Hercules is reduced to ashes by the fires of Mount Oeta in order to cease to be a man. Apollo tended the flocks of Admetus. Neptune built walls for Laomedon, and the unfortunate builder did not receive payment for his labor. In the island of Crete, one can see the cave of Jupiter, and his tomb is shown there. It is known that he drove Saturn out of there, and the country where he hid was called Latium. One Saturn taught writing and was the first in Italy to mint coins, which is why the treasury is called Saturn's. He was also engaged in agriculture and is therefore depicted as an old man carrying a scythe. He, in exile, was given shelter by Janus, from whom he received the name Janiculum and the month of Januarius, and who is depicted as two-faced, so that, standing as if in the middle, he looks apparently at the coming and passing year. But the Moors clearly honor kings and do not conceal this in any way, and therefore the worship of the gods varies according to the differences of peoples and regions, so that not everyone honors one god, but each observes his own worship of his ancestors. Alexander the Great, in his famous book, writes to his mother that the priest, out of fear of his power, gave him the secret of the gods, meant that the preservation of the memory of ancestors and kings served as a reason for the rites of celebration and sacrifice. But if gods were born at one time, why are they not born now? Has Jupiter grown old or Juno become barren? And why do you consider those gods powerful for the Romans, who could not defend their own against their weapons? For we know the native gods of the Romans. They have Romulus, who became a god through the perjury of Procus. They have Picus, Tiberinus, Polumnus, and Coni, the god of deceit, whom Romulus, after the treacherous abduction of the Saban women, ordered to be honored as the god of counsel. Tatius found and honored the goddess Cloacina, Hostilius, Pavorus, and Palorus. Soon, I do not know by whom, Fabris, Alca, and Flora, dissolute women, were deified. These are the Roman gods. Furthermore, Mars of Thrace, Jupiter of Crete, Juno of Argos, Samos and Phoenicia, Diana of Tauride and Idaea, the mother of the gods and the Egyptian monsters, are not deities, because if they had any power, they would have preserved their kingdoms for their own. True, the Romans also have conquered Penates, which the fugitive Aeneas brought back. There is also a bald Venus, who is much more vile than the wounded Venus of Homer. As for kingdoms, they do not pass according to merit, but change in turn. Thus, as is well known, the Assyrians, Medes, and Persians ruled before, the Greeks and Egyptians reigned. Then, with the succession of powers, the time came for the Romans to rule over the others. But the beginning of their reign is shameful. A crowd of villains and robbers gathers together, and having established a refuge for impunity for crimes, increases its number. Then, in order that the king may be the first in crime, Romulus becomes a fratricide, and in order to introduce marriage, he begins a love affair with Discord. They kidnap, rage, deceive in order to increase the number of citizens. Marriages among them are violated rites of hospitality and cruel wars with relatives. The highest dignity among the Romans is the consulate, but the consulate also began in the same way as the kingdom. Brutus kills his sons, that by the fame of such a crime he may increase the glory of this dignity. Thus it was not by the observance of religious rites, nor by omens and prophecies, that the dominion of the Romans increased, but they simply guarded the chosen time until a certain date. However, Regulus listened to the omens and was captured and defeated. Mancinus also held to religion and fell under the yoke. Paulus kept chickens to divine by the grain they ate, and yet was killed at Cannae. And Caesar, disregarding the prophecies and omens which forbade him to sail to Africa before winter, sailed there all the more conveniently and conquered. In everything, the trickery, deception, and seduction of a stupid and credulous people are signs that obscure the truth. There are unclean, wandering spirits who, mired in worldly vices and separated from the heavenly power through passion for the earthly, do not cease themselves lost to destroy, themselves depraved to spread debauchery. The poets know them under the name of demons, and Socrates said that he receives instructions from a demon and is governed by his arbitrariness. The most famous of the Magi, and the Magi borrow from them the strength for their actions, both malicious and amusing. Gostan, rejecting the possibility of seeing the image of the true God, says that true angels stand before his throne. Plato agrees with this, who, recognizing one God, calls the others angels or demons. Hermes Trismegistus also speaks of one God and calls him incomprehensible and invaluable. Thus, these deified spirits are hidden under statues and images. They inspire the hearts of soothsayers by inspiration. They quicken the nerves of exiles. They direct the flight of birds. They rule over destinies. They make prophecies, always mixing lies with truth, so that they themselves deceive. They disturb life, they disturb sleep, and having invaded bodies secretly, they frighten minds, disfigure limbs, spoil health, cause diseases in order to force people to worship them, and when, sated with the smell of altars and the fires of animals, they leave what they have kept, then they seem to be healers, because the cure from them consists in stopping their slander. Their main concern is to distract people from God, to lead people away from the understanding of true religion, to superstitious worship of themselves, and since they themselves are condemned to death, to seek participants in the execution, in those whom they succeed in deceiving into participating in their crime. But when we conjure them by the true God, they immediately yield, confess, and are forced to come out of the bodies they contain. See how they are scourged by our voice and the action of the hidden majesty, roasted as if by fire, stretched out by the addition of the continuing execution, howling, groaning, beseeching aloud their very worshippers, confessing whence they came and whither they will go. Then either they immediately come out or disappear gradually, according as the faith of the sufferer cooperates here, or the grace of the surrenderer helps. For this they also try to sow hatred towards us in the crowd, so that people will begin to hate us before they know us, so that, having known us, they will not begin to imitate us or cease to condemn us. Thus, one is the Lord of all God. His greatness cannot have a partner because he himself is almighty. For the sovereignty of God, let us take an example from earthly things. Has a joint reign ever begun with fidelity or ended without bloodshed? Among the Thebans the kinship is broken, and even death did not end the discord in the hostile fires. The Roman twins who were carried together in one womb could not be contained in one kingdom. Pompey and Caesar were related, and yet did not preserve a natural union because of jealousy of power. And it is not surprising to see this in men, when the same is observed in all nature. There is one queen among the bees, one leader in the flocks, one leader in the herds. how much more is there one ruler of the world, who holds all things by word, disposes of reason, and accomplishes by force? He can neither be seen, he is too bright for sight, nor touched, he is too pure for touch, nor appreciated, he is above conception. And then we honor him worthily, when we call him inestimable. What temple can God have, whose temple is the whole world? How can the power of such greatness be enclosed in one small building when man lives more luxuriously? We must worship him in our minds, honor him in our hearts, and do not seek a name for God. God is his name. Words are needed where it is necessary to astonish the rabble with our own differences of names. But for God, who is only one, everything is contained in the word God. He is one and everywhere present, so that even the rabble recognizes one God in many, when the mind and ears are reminded of their author and master. We often hear people say, "Oh God, God sees, I entrust to God. May God reward you, as God pleases, if God willing." Therefore, the greatest crime is not to want to know God, whom it is impossible not to know. Now, in order about Christ and how salvation was granted to us through him. At first, the Jews had grace with God. So righteous were they in ancient times, so their ancestors observed the statutes of religion. That is why their kingdom reached its most flourishing state, and the greatness of the family occurred. But then, when they, having become careless, unpunished, and proud, having relied too much on their forefathers, disdained the divine commandments, they lost the grace granted to them. And how unclean their life became, how offensively they violated religion, they themselves now testify, if not in word, then in event. Scattered and pale, they wander, deprived of their land and heaven, they seek shelter with strangers. Meanwhile, God had already foretold that at the end of the age and the approach of the end of the world, he would gather for himself from every language, people, and place, worshippers more faithful and more obedient, and they would draw from the divine gifts that grace which was granted to the Jews, but which they had lost through the violation of the statutes of religion. And so, as the administrator of grace and the instructor of decorum, the Word, the Son of God, the enlightener and teacher of the human race, foretold by all the previous prophets, is sent. He, the power of God, his mind, wisdom, and glory, dwells in the Virgin. The Holy Spirit is clothed in flesh. God unites with man. He, our God Christ, the mediator between the Father and us, is clothed in man in order to lead him to the Father. Christ wanted to be what man is, so that man could be what Christ is. The Jews knew that Christ would come, because the prophets in their predictions always reminded them of this. But since the prophets indicated a twofold coming of him, one in which he was to appear as a man in actions and form, and the other in which they would recognize him as God, the Jews, not having understood the first coming, which secretly preceded in suffering, believe only in the one that will be revealed in power. Such a lack of understanding on the part of the Jews was a deserved consequence of their sins. They were punished with blindness in wisdom and understanding, so that being unworthy of life, they did not see life, although they had it before their eyes. And therefore, when Jesus Christ, as the prophets had foretold before, by his word and command cast out demons from people, healed the paralytic, gave sight to the blind, the lame the ability to walk, raised the dead, forced the elements to obey him, the winds to serve, the seas to obey, hell to yield, the Jews considering him, by the humility of flesh and body, only a man, recognized him as a sorcerer by the freedom of power. Their teachers and elders, whom he put to shame by teaching and wisdom, inflamed with anger and indignation, persecuted him, and finally, having captured him, handed him over to the Roman governor of Syria, Pontius Pilate, forcibly and stubbornly, demanding crucifixion and death. He himself predicted that they would do this, and all the prophets had testified before that he must suffer, not in order to suffer death, but to conquer, and that after his suffering he must return again to the highest to show the power of the divine majesty. Thus the course of events fulfilled faith. Having been crucified by the executioner, he voluntarily gave up the ghost, and on the third day he rose again voluntarily. He appeared to his disciples as he was, so that when they saw him, they recognized him, remaining with them, visible in his bodily being. He remained with them 40 days, instructing them in the commandments of life and teaching them what they were afterwards to teach. Then he was raised up to heaven by the cloud that surrounded him, that he might lead up to the Father as conqueror, the man whom he loved, whom he clothed himself with, whom he had delivered from death. He will come again from heaven, but with the power of a punisher, and with the authority of a judge to punish the devil and to judge the human race. Meanwhile, his disciples, according to the command of the teacher and God, dispersed throughout the world to teach the commandments for salvation, to lead people from the darkness of errors to the path of light, to enlighten the blind and ignorant to the knowledge of the truth. For greater certainty of proof, for a more faithful confession of Christ, they are tempted by tortures, crosses, and many kinds of executions. Illness is added a witness of the truth, so that Christ, the Son of God, given to people for life, was proclaimed not only by the preaching of the word, but also by the testimony of suffering. We accompany him, we follow him, we have him as our leader on the way, the chief of light, the author of salvation, who promises heaven and the Father to those who seek and partake. Christians, and we will be what Christ is if we imitate Christ.